She stared into his soul and said, "If you hadn't come that day, they would have buried me in silence." Adam Whitaker was a man who once believed that providing money was enough to be called a father, that silence between visits was just part of modern parenting. He had no idea how wrong he was until the day he knocked on a familiar door and saw his daughter again, not the bright-eyed girl he remembered, but a ghost wearing a hoodie too big for her small frame with eyes that flinched instead of smiled. Ellie didn't speak. She didn't reach for him. She simply turned and walked back inside like she was already used to disappearing. That single moment cracked something open inside Adam, a quiet gnawing dread that maybe love wasn't enough unless you stayed. What followed wasn't a battle for custody. It was a reckoning, a chance not just to prove he could be a father, but to understand the damage of absence, of not hearing a child's silence as a scream. And in Ellie's stillness in her drawings, instead of words, Adam would begin the slow, painful journey of learning to stay not just in a house, but in her life. Adam stood frozen in front of the weathered green door, the late autumn wind biting at his neck as he raised his hand to knock. For a moment he hesitated, not because he didn't want to see her, but because he was terrified of what he might find. It had been 2 long months that stretched into an unbearable silence since the last time he'd seen his daughter Ellie. And though he tried to justify the distance with work logistics and court orders, none of that mattered now. What mattered was that behind this door was a little girl who used to run into his arms, giggling with her front teeth missing, smelling of crayons and baby shampoo. That girl used to write him notes with hearts for punctuation, used to wait by the window when he said he was coming. He remembered her eyes, full of spark, full of life. But when the door finally creaked open so slowly it was almost painful, what he saw wasn't her. It wasn't even close. Ellie stood there like a shadow, like someone had carved out all the light from inside her and left only the outline. Her hoodie was too big, swallowing her thin shoulders. Her face was pale, drawn, almost expressionless. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. And worse, she didn't speak. Her eyes, once so vibrant and mischievous, didn't look at him. They slipped past his shoulder like he was just another figure in a world she no longer trusted. Adam opened his mouth to say something, anything but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to say her name, to tell her he missed her, to apologize for every second he had spent away. But Ellie simply turned without a word and walked back into the house, her small frame disappearing into the dim hallway like she was vanishing into the walls. Adam stood there, hands still outstretched, unsure whether to step in or stay frozen in place. Something was wrong, deeply, disturbingly wrong. This wasn't shyness. It wasn't moodiness. This was absence, emotional vacancy, as if his daughter had learned how to erase herself from the inside out. He stepped into the house cautiously, his shoes echoing on the wooden floor. Vanessa was nowhere in sight. The home smelled sterile, too clean, too quiet. On the walls there were no drawings, no school photos, nothing to indicate a child lived there. Ellie was already seated on the couch, legs pulled up, hugging her knees. The TV was on, but the volume was low and she wasn't watching it. Her eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking. Adam sat on the other side, unsure of the space between them, unsure whether she would flinch if he moved too close. He wanted to ask 100 questions. What happened? Are you okay? Do you remember me? But he knew words wouldn't fix this. Not now. Not yet. All he could do was sit beside her and watch her from the corner of his eye, hoping for a sign. But even her breathing seemed quieter than it should be. She was like a bird that had been caged too long, wings clipped, trust shattered. And Adam, standing there now, witnessing the aftermath of his absence, realized this wasn't just a visit. It was a rescue. And he might be too late. She wore a gray hoodie that swallowed her frame sleeves, drooping past her wrists like wilted branches, the hood casting a shadow over half her face as if she were trying to disappear inside it. The fabric hung awkwardly on her, far too large for a child her age, and Adam couldn't tell if it was chosen for comfort or concealment. But as his eyes lowered, he noticed the bruising, faint, bluish-purple smudges blooming across her forearms like silent accusations. His heart clenched. He tried not to stare, not to react, but every protective instinct inside him screamed. The marks weren't fresh, but they hadn't faded either. Ellie stood stiffly, arms by her sides, fingers curled loosely, as if she didn't quite know what to do with her hands. She didn't look up, didn't meet his eyes, didn't say a word. She didn't even flinch when the wind pushed past Adam into the doorway, tousling her unbrushed hair across her cheeks. No "Hi, Dad." No "Where have you been?" Not even curiosity. Just absence. Pure practiced detachment, like someone who had been trained not to expect anything from anyone anymore. Adam swallowed hard, his voice caught behind the tightness in his chest. He wanted to kneel, to call her name gently, to reach for her hand, but something in her posture warned him not to. She was rigid, like a porcelain figure placed at the threshold only to complete the illusion of normalcy. Not alive, not responsive, just present. And even that felt like a fragile, borrowed thing. He opened his mouth, tried to find her name, just her name, but the sound that came out was more breath than voice. Ellie didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on a spot just beyond his shoulder, unfocused, like she was staring at a thought no one else could see. Adam stepped back instinctively, as though his presence alone was a disruption. There was no emotion in her face. Not sadness, not anger, not even fear. It was worse than fear. It was nothing. Like a switch had been flipped inside her, and no one had thought to turn it back on. Without a word, she turned around and walked slowly into the house, feet dragging slightly on the carpet, not from rebellion or laziness, but like someone who no longer remembered how to move with purpose. Adam stood frozen in the doorway, stunned by the ghost that had replaced his daughter. He couldn't breathe for a second, couldn't think. How long had she been like this? How had no one noticed? Or worse, how had everyone chosen not to see it? There had been a time when Ellie's energy could fill a room, when she ran into his arms with paint on her fingers and stories spilling from her mouth so fast she forgot to breathe. Now she made no sound, didn't even close the door behind her. And somehow that small detail, the open door swinging gently in the wind, made everything feel unbearably hollow. Adam stepped inside, gently closing it behind him, but the quiet that swallowed the room felt like a warning. He had always thought he would know if something was truly wrong, that some instinct would scream out if Ellie was in danger. But now, standing in this sterile silence, all he could feel was shame. He hadn't seen it. He hadn't asked. And Ellie, his Ellie, had learned to survive by shutting the world out, one emotion at a time. Adam couldn't speak. The words dissolved before they ever reached his mouth, trapped behind the sudden, overwhelming weight pressing against his chest. Everything in him was screaming, but his body stood frozen, locked in place by the sight of his daughter, what she had become, or more hauntingly, what had been stripped away. He knew with a clarity that hit like a punch to the gut that something was terribly, unforgivably wrong. He didn't need a doctor's report, a therapist's diagnosis, or a long, convoluted story. One look at Ellie, how she avoided his eyes, how her shoulders hunched protectively inward, how she moved like she expected pain, even when none was visible, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just the result of a difficult divorce or a shy child adjusting to change. This was damage, something deeper, something that had been allowed to fester in silence. Her silence. And suddenly, Adam realized that silence had become her shield, her only defense, and maybe her only survival tactic. He remembered how talkative she used to be, how she'd once asked 1,000 questions about rainbows and airplanes and whether cats dream when they sleep. And now she said nothing. Not a word. Not even a whisper. He tried to step toward her but stopped himself, sensing that even his movement might be too much. There was a stillness around Ellie that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like a warning. She wasn't just withdrawn. She was hiding in plain sight. Not from him personally, but from the world, from touch, from memory, from herself. Adam felt a cold sweat on the back of his neck, a deep, soul-sinking fear he hadn't felt since the night she was born, and the nurses had taken too long to say everything was okay. But this time, there was no nurse, no reassurance. Just a little girl wearing a hoodie too large, bruises half hidden on her skin, and a gaze so empty it felt like staring into a locked room where no one lived anymore. And what haunted him most was the thought that maybe that room had been locked because he hadn't come back sooner. That his absence had given permission for someone else to fill the silence, someone who didn't deserve to be near her. He wondered how long she had been like this. Weeks, months. Had she tried to call out? Had she waited by the door and eventually given up? His throat tightened. He wanted to ask her, wanted to demand answers from someone, from anyone. But in that moment, all he could do was watch as Ellie disappeared down the hall without a glance back, her footsteps, soft like she had learned how to move without making noise. Adam knew that sound. He had read about it in case files. The quiet steps of children who no longer want to be noticed, who learned that being invisible was safer than being seen. And now, standing in this unfamiliar house, Adam realized with bone-deep certainty, this wasn't just a visit. This was the front door of a war zone, and his daughter was the only survivor. She hadn't run to him because she didn't know if he was real. She hadn't smiled because she no longer remembered how. And he who thought love was enough even from a distance was standing in the ruins of everything he failed to protect. The car ride was silent, but not the kind of silence that felt calm or comforting. It was the kind that buzzed under your skin, heavy and sharp, like the air just before a storm. Adam gripped the steering wheel tightly, Knuckles' white eyes flicking between the road and the small, silent figure beside him. Ellie sat in the passenger seat, curled toward the window face, half hidden by her hood, her gaze fixed on something distant and unreachable. She didn't speak, didn't shift, didn't respond when he glanced at her with a tentative smile. The seatbelt pressed gently across her chest, but even that seemed like too much contact, like she was trying to make herself smaller, less there. Adam took a quiet breath and tried to start a conversation. "So, how's school?" he asked, forcing casual warmth into his voice as if tone alone could make this feel normal. Ellie didn't answer. Her expression didn't change. He waited a few seconds, then continued. "Do you still like math? You used to beat me at those little flashcard games, remember?" "Nothing, not even a flicker." He kept going, desperate now. "Any friends you hang out with? What about food? Still into macaroni and cheese? Or did you switch to something cooler like sushi?" The corner of his mouth lifted a weak attempt at humor. But Ellie didn't laugh, didn't smile, didn't even blink in his direction. She simply stared out the window like the world outside was more real than the man beside her. Adam's throat tightened. He tried again, softer this time. "Ellie, sweetheart, I missed you." Still no reply. Just the faint sound of tires against asphalt and the quiet hum of the engine. He looked down briefly at the radio, hesitated, then turned it on low. Some instrumental music station, gentle piano drifting into the car like a fragile offering of peace. Ellie reached toward the volume knob almost instantly and turned it down almost to mute. Adam didn't say anything. He just watched, heartbreaking, as his daughter shrank further into herself. This wasn't shyness. This wasn't the awkwardness of a child adjusting to a new setting. This was shutdown, a full practiced emotional retreat. She hadn't just stopped talking to him, she had stopped letting anyone in at all. He remembered how animated she used to be in car rides, how she once made up songs about the clouds and quizzed him on dinosaur facts. Now she was a ghost beside him, all presence and no voice. And the worst part wasn't her silence. It was the way it seemed completely normal to her, like she'd been living in this void for so long that she no longer expected anyone to fill it. Adam glanced at her again, her reflection faint in the window. She looked older than 9 somehow, not in size but in energy or the lack of it. He didn't know how to reach her, didn't know what to say that wouldn't make her retreat even further. So he kept driving, hands steady, eyes forward, heart heavy. He would give her time, he told himself. He would earn her voice back. Even if it took days, even if it took months, even if she never said a word but just looked at him one day and let herself be seen again. Until then, he would keep trying. Because the silence she carried wasn't just quiet, it was pain. And if he couldn't fix it yet, he would at least be there. He would not leave again. Adam reached forward and gently turned the knob on the dashboard, letting the soft notes of a classical piano piece filter into the tense silence of the car. It wasn't loud, just a low, calming melody, the kind of music that might ease nerves, something gentle to fill the heavy space between him and Ellie. He hadn't chosen it deliberately. It was the first station that didn't have shouting voices or ads. The piano played something slow and familiar, the kind of song that used to soothe her as a toddler when she couldn't sleep back, when her emotions were loud, open, and unapologetic. But now, as the soft music reached her, Ellie's hand moved quickly, automatically to the volume knob, turning it down so low the sound was barely there. Not abrupt, not aggressive, just decisive. She didn't look at him, didn't explain, didn't need to. Her action was simple but loud in its own way, and to Adam it said more than any sentence could. She didn't want noise, not even gentle, beautiful noise. She didn't want anything entering her space, no melody, no warmth, no attempt at soothing what she had already learned to survive without. Adam's hand hovered near the steering wheel for a second before retreating. He didn't reach to turn it back up. He didn't protest. He just watched her quietly, trying to understand the depth of that small, almost imperceptible rejection. Once upon a time, Ellie had begged for music, had twirled in the living room in her socks to the rhythm of strings and keys, had asked him to replay the same lullaby over and over until she drifted into sleep. Now she couldn't even bear a whisper of sound. It struck him then that this wasn't about music at all. It was about control, about boundaries, about how loud the world must have been in her mind, even if everything around her seemed quiet. Maybe she didn't want the music because it reminded her of something she lost, or maybe she had learned to associate sound with unpredictability, raised voices slamming doors, threats whispered just loud enough to hurt, but not loud enough to be believed. Adam didn't know yet. He only knew that Ellie had changed. And not in the way children are supposed to, growing taller, learning new words, picking new interests. This change was unnatural. It was careful, guarded, like she had built a wall so high that even something as harmless as a song couldn't be allowed in. He kept his eyes on the road, though the turn of her wrist, the subtle twist of her fingers as she lowered the volume, replayed in his mind over and over. How often had she been silenced? How often had she silenced herself? And what would it take to make her feel safe enough to want to hear again, to want to feel again? He didn't say anything else. He let the silence remain, not because he didn't care, but because he was beginning to understand that rushing her would only push her further into that invisible place where she now lived. So he drove, letting the faint, almost inaudible melody drift beneath them like a current. And he made a silent promise to her right then, not to fix her in a day, not to expect her to return to who she was before, but to stay beside her long enough that she might one day turn the music up on her own. She wasn't angry, she wasn't afraid. That much Adam could sense with a strange, hollow certainty as he stole another glance at the small girl beside him. There was no tension in her jaw, no clenched fists, no tears threatening to fall. Ellie wasn't bracing herself for a fight, and she wasn't flinching from him like a frightened animal. No, what chilled him even more was the absence of any of it. She simply wasn't there, not in the way a person usually is. She had vanished into herself, retreating so deeply that even though her body sat upright in the seatbelt fastened properly, legs crossed in quiet compliance, she felt more like a shadow than a child. Her eyes were locked on the window, but she wasn't looking at the trees rushing by, or the distant houses, or the gray sky overhead. She wasn't observing the world at all. She was staring into something far beyond it, some private place she had escaped to long ago, a parallel world where she could not be touched, not questioned, not hurt. And even though Adam couldn't follow her there, he could feel its existence, could feel the vast distance between them, a chasm that no words could bridge right now. It was in the way she blinked slowly, not reacting to the rhythm of the road or the occasional passing car. It was in the way her lips stayed slightly parted, but no breath of sound ever passed through. She had learned to disappear without leaving, to erase herself without running away. And in that moment, Adam realized something that knocked the breath from his chest. Ellie had mastered invisibility not as a game, but as a defense, a strategy, a survival instinct. She had trained herself to be quiet, to be still, to be nothing, because maybe being nothing was safer than being someone. Maybe someone had hurt her so deeply that the only place left where she could feel safe was this silent world behind her eyes. The thought made Adam grip the steering wheel harder, as if the leather could absorb his grief. He didn't cry. He couldn't. All he could do was mourn quietly for the little girl who used to fill a room with color, sound, and laughter. He remembered how she used to wave at strangers from the back seat, press her nose to the glass and name shapes in the clouds. Now she sat utterly motionless, as if even existing out loud might bring danger. He wondered what she saw in that other world she stared into. Was it a place with no shouting, no cold silences, no hands that hurt and voices that blamed? Was it a place where she could breathe without fear of being seen too much or not enough? He didn't know. He just knew she had gone somewhere he couldn't reach. Not yet. And so he didn't try to speak again. He didn't try to pull her back with soft questions or warm reassurances, because she wasn't resisting him. She wasn't rejecting him. She was simply gone. And until she chose to return, until she felt it was safe to feel again, he would sit in this silence with her. He would not leave. He would not rush her. He would honor the distance with presence, with patience. Because if Ellie had taught herself to disappear, then maybe, just maybe, with enough time and love, she could also learn to come back. When they got home, Adam gently unlocked the door and stepped aside to let Ellie walk in first. But she hesitated only for a moment before slipping past him like a whisper of wind, her small frame barely making a sound. She didn't look around the house, didn't take in the soft couch, the framed photos, the warm glow of the kitchen light. Instead, she walked straight to the farthest corner of the living room and slowly sank to the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest as she hugged her small faded backpack like it was the only thing in the world that still belonged to her. She didn't ask where she'd be sleeping. She didn't ask what they were having for dinner, or whether they could watch a movie or play a game or even just talk. She said nothing, wanted nothing, needed nothing. Adam stood nearby, frozen for a moment, unsure whether to kneel beside her or give her space. Her eyes weren't closed, but she wasn't looking at anything around her either. Just curled in on herself, the backpack clutched tight to her body like a shield, her chin resting lightly on her knees. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't sadness in the way most people recognized it. It was emptiness, a kind of quiet that felt deeper than words, like she had made peace with being invisible and no longer had the strength to want more. Adam asked softly if she was hungry. No response. He offered water juice, even her old favorite strawberry milk, but her expression didn't change. He tried again this time, suggesting they could draw or build a puzzle or do anything she wanted. Still nothing. She wasn't angry. She wasn't scared. She simply didn't want. And that truth, more than anything else, broke him. Most children would have explored a new room, touched things, asked questions, shown some curiosity. But Ellie stayed there in the same small corner, as if she was afraid that wanting something, anything, might lead to disappointment or punishment. Like she had learned that needing too much could make people go away. Adam sat down quietly on the other side of the room, not pushing, just being, watching her, waiting, hoping that the silence between them would eventually soften, that she might feel even just a little that this place was different. that she was safe here, that she could want something again and it would not be used against her. But for now, Ellie made no requests. No eye contact, no movement. Just a little girl curled in the corner holding a backpack like a lifeline, asking for nothing because she had learned long ago that nothing was safer than everything. Adam watched her from across the room, her tiny frame curled into itself like a question with no answer, still holding the backpack as if it were a shield against the world. He didn't speak. He didn't ask again if she was okay because he already knew she wasn't. Instead, he rose quietly and walked into the kitchen, opening the fridge with deliberate care as if the sound itself might startle her. He poured a glass of warm milk just the way she used to like it, not too hot, not too cold. Then opened the linen closet and pulled out one of the softest blankets he could find, freshly washed, still carrying the faint scent of lavender detergent. When he returned to the living room, Ellie hadn't moved. Not an inch. She sat there, knees tucked under her chin, eyes fixed on a point somewhere far away, deep inside herself. Adam approached slowly, careful not to step too loudly, and crouched down near her. Not too close, just near enough that she could see him if she chose to. He gently placed the blanket to her left, neatly folded, and then the warm glass of milk beside it, making sure it was within her reach but not forced into her space. He didn't say anything, didn't explain what the items were for. He simply left them like quiet offerings, gestures of care that didn't require acceptance, only presence. He stayed there for a moment longer, watching for any sign, any flicker in her eyes, or shift in her posture, but Ellie remained perfectly still, like a statue of herself, carved from silence. So he did the hardest thing a parent can do when faced with a hurting child. He let go, just enough. Not of love, not of hope, but of the need for immediate response. He stood up slowly, the floor creaking beneath his step, and backed away, giving her the space she clearly needed. As he walked toward the hallway, he paused one last time and looked back. Ellie hadn't touched the milk, hadn't unfolded the blanket, but somehow leaving them there felt like a small seed planted in frozen ground, a whisper that said, "I see you, I'm here, and you don't have to speak for me to stay." Then, with quiet resolve, Adam turned away and walked down the hall, not retreating in defeat, but giving her the safety of distance without the pain of abandonment. He didn't close his bedroom door that night. He left it cracked just in case. Because maybe, just maybe, the next move would be hers, not because she was ready, but because she finally believed she could. The next morning, as pale light crept through the curtains and softened the edges of the furniture in the quiet house, Adam walked slowly into the living room, his heart beating faster than it should have for such a simple task. He hadn't slept much. His mind had been turning all night, caught between worry and hope, replaying every detail of Ellie's stillness, her silence, her vanishing into herself. He hadn't expected anything to change overnight, but still some small part of him, a part he dared not admit out loud, had whispered that maybe, just maybe, something would be different in the morning. As he stepped barefoot onto the cool wood floor, his eyes immediately landed on the small corner where Ellie had curled herself the night before. She was no longer there. The blanket he had folded so gently lay half-draped across the cushion, slightly crumpled as if someone had at least touched it. But it was the glass that stopped him cold. The one he had placed so carefully beside her, the warm milk she hadn't even glanced at last night, was empty, not knocked over, not forgotten. Just gone, drunk, clean. A single small fingerprint was smudged on the side, barely visible in the soft morning light, and that tiny mark felt like thunder in Adam's chest. It wasn't just that she had taken the milk, it was what it meant. It meant she had accepted something. It meant she had reached quietly, cautiously, without a word, and allowed herself to take in a gesture of care. It was small, infinitesimally small, but it was also everything. A silent yes. Not to him, not yet, but to the idea that she didn't have to be completely alone here. He stood there for a long moment, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the fragile magic of that empty glass. His daughter hadn't said a word. She hadn't looked him in the eye or moved toward him or even acknowledged his presence. But she had made a choice, and that choice was a beginning. It told him she was still in there somewhere behind the walls she had built, watching, assessing, deciding whether this new version of her life was safe enough to step into. He didn't call out to her. He didn't rush through the house in search of her. Instead, he walked slowly to the sink, placed the glass down with gentle reverence, and let himself smile, not broadly, not triumphantly, but with quiet, aching gratitude. Because sometimes love doesn't begin with words. Sometimes it begins with an empty glass and the hope that tomorrow she might drink again. There were no words exchanged that morning, no greetings, no smiles, no acknowledgement of the empty glass now sitting quietly in the sink. Ellie didn't come into the kitchen. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't say thank you or offer even the smallest gesture of recognition. And yet Adam knew something had shifted. That glass now washed and drying on the rack was more than just an object. It was a message, a signal, a whisper from behind the wall she had built so carefully. I'm still here. I'm watching. She hadn't spoken, but in choosing to drink that milk she had responded. Not with words, not with certainty, but with a test. A test to see if the person on the other side of the silence would stay. Because maybe after everything she had endured, after all the promises that had been broken and all the hands that had failed to hold her when she needed them most, Ellie had stopped believing in words. Maybe she had learned that what people said didn't matter half as much as whether they stayed when it wasn't easy, when it was inconvenient, exhausting, or painfully quiet. So she gave him the smallest opportunity to prove himself, not by asking for anything, but by accepting something. That milk wasn't about hunger. It wasn't about comfort. It was a silent experiment. Will he notice? Will he care? Will he leave anyway now that he thinks I'm okay? Adam didn't try to celebrate it too loudly in his own mind. He knew this wasn't some breakthrough, some magical cure. It wasn't an invitation into her world yet. But it was a footstep, a breath, a moment of shared space, even if it existed in the gap between them, rather than in any spoken exchange. He moved carefully through the morning, making coffee with quiet hands, pretending not to glance toward the hallway, where he assumed she now sat or lay, or stood listening, observing. He kept his movements soft, his presence gentle, never too loud or too close. Because he understood now, Ellie wasn't waiting to be saved. She was waiting to see if he would stay. She was studying him the way you study a wild animal who's been hurt too many times, checking for sudden movements, for hidden threats. And if he failed that test, if he reached too fast or spoke too soon, she would vanish again behind her silence, deeper than before. So he let the morning stretch on quietly, letting her lead without pressure. Because love in that house was no longer about big gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about patience, about showing up without expectation, about proving with every quiet moment that this time, someone was going to stay. The courtroom was colder than Adam expected, sterile, echoing with the low murmur of shuffled papers and distant footsteps on tile. He sat at the petitioner's table, his hands folded tightly together, the tension in his shoulders a silent war against the fear clenching in his chest. Across the room sat Vanessa, calm and polished as always, her expression unreadable. The judge, a woman with a steady voice and tired eyes, called the session to order. What unfolded next wasn't a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet battle of timelines, affidavits, and testimonies. Custody. That was the word wrapped around everything, the legal name for what was truly at stake, Ellie's future. The courtroom's clinical language masked the raw truth that this wasn't just about who provided shelter or school access or medical insurance. It was about who had failed her and who still might. Adam's attorney laid out his case with care, how Adam had returned when he realized something was wrong, how he had begun to notice Ellie's emotional withdrawal, her refusal to speak, the bruises that seemed too carefully explained. Vanessa countered with photos of birthday parties, report cards, a doctor's note dismissing any real concern. But the facts couldn't erase the image of Ellie as she had first appeared, silent, weightless, more ghost than girl. Adam's heart ached as her name was passed between lawyers like property. Every sentence felt like it cost Ellie something, another layer of her story lost in translation. But he sat still, not out of fear, but out of promise. He would not let this process break him, because Ellie needed one person in her world who refused to disappear when things got hard. This was not just a hearing. It was a vow delivered through silence, persistence, and the unwavering presence of a father who had come back too late, but would not leave again. Vanessa walked into the courtroom like she owned it, not with arrogance, but with the kind of elegance that draws eyes before she even speaks. She wore a tailored navy suit that hugged her like a second skin, her posture straight, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she moved with controlled grace. Her expression was calm, even warm, a mask perfected over years of knowing exactly what to say, when to say it, and how to say it in a way that disarmed anyone who dared to question her. She took the stand with the poise of a queen defending her realm. Not shaken, not defensive, just composed and deliberate. When asked about Ellie's behavior, she tilted her head slightly and gave a soft, rehearsed smile. Ellie's always been a quiet child, she said, her voice smooth as silk. She's introspective, thoughtful. She's not one of those loud, expressive children, never has been. Her eyes flicked toward Adam Sharp for just a fraction of a second before she continued, "I know my daughter. Adam, bless his heart, hasn't been around enough to understand how she expresses herself. He means well, but he's misreading her." The courtroom took in her words like fact, because Vanessa spoke with certainty, and certainty in a courtroom can be more dangerous than truth. She painted a picture of a sensitive girl, one who didn't need loud affection or constant attention, just space and understanding. She framed Adam as a man reacting emotionally to something he didn't grasp, a father trying to insert himself into a world he'd long left behind. And sitting there, Adam could feel how easily her version of the story slid into place. It wasn't outrageous. It was plausible. And that was what made it terrifying. Because the lie wasn't loud, it was careful, elegant, and dressed in just enough truth to pass. Adam wanted to stand. He wanted to object, to tear through the polished veneer of Vanessa's carefully crafted narrative and shout the truth until anyone listened. But as he sat there, hands clenched in his lap, his mouth remained shut, not because he lacked conviction, but because he lacked proof. That was the cruelest part of all. There were no photographs of fresh bruises. The ones he had seen were faint, almost gone, the kind that could be dismissed as a fall, a bump against a doorknob, a playground accident. There were no witnesses, no teachers who had spoken up, no recorded complaints, no medical reports that screamed danger. Ellie hadn't said a word. Not to the court, not to a therapist, not even to him. Her silence, the very thing that told Adam something was deeply wrong, now worked against him like a weapon turned backward. He had nothing solid to offer, only his instincts, his guilt, and the memory of a little girl curled in a corner refusing to eat, speak, or even look at the world. The courtroom didn't want instincts, it wanted evidence, and the system wasn't built to catch what couldn't be seen. So when his lawyer asked gently if Adam had anything further to add, he opened his mouth and then closed it again. Because what could he say? She looked hollow. She drank the milk I left her, but only after I left the room. She's not afraid she's disappeared into herself. None of that would sway a judge. Not when the other side had report cards, photo albums, and confident smiles. So Adam sat in silence, feeling the weight of every second pass like judgment. He knew the truth. He saw it in Ellie's eyes. But the truth in this room wasn't enough. Not without scars that bled, not without screams caught on tape. Just when it seemed the tide had turned fully in Vanessa's favor, when even the judge began to nod with a kind of reluctant acceptance that favored routine over risk, a voice rose from the back of the courtroom, gentle but firm, cutting through the sterile air like a warm breeze in winter. "Your Honor," it said. Hesitating just slightly, "May I speak?" Heads turned. Even the judge looked up surprised. There near the rear bench stood a woman in her 60s, modestly dressed in a pale cardigan and faded slacks, hands folded respectfully in front of her eyes, calm but unwavering. It was Rosa, the old housekeeper, the one who had been with Vanessa for years, invisible to most, present for everything. Vanessa stiffened just for a moment, and Adam saw it, a flicker of something sharp pass through her expression. Rosa had not been called as a witness. She wasn't on anyone's list. But the judge studied her, then nodded. "State your name and relation to the parties," she instructed. Rosa stepped forward, her voice steady. "My name is Rosa Martinez. I was a housekeeper for Miss Vanessa and took care of Ellie since she was a baby. I was there nearly every day for 8 years. She paused, then looked directly at the judge, not flinching. "And I need to say something, because no one else is speaking for Ellie." A quiet fell over the room, heavy and expectant. Adam sat upright, his heart pounding. For the first time all day, he felt something shift, not in paperwork or legal jargon, but in the room itself, in the moral balance of the space. Rosa wasn't polished or powerful. She didn't have lawyers or records. But she had been there. She had seen things. And now, against every expectation, she had chosen to speak. Not for herself, but for the silent girl no one truly understood. Rosa stood at the front of the courtroom, hands trembling slightly as she glanced at the judge, then at Ellie's empty seat, and finally at Adam, who sat frozen with breath caught in his chest. Her voice, when it came, was soft but cracked with the weight of memories long buried. I used to hear her laugh. She began the words barely above a whisper, not just smile, but laugh. Ellie loved to sing around the house, little songs she'd make up while she played. She'd sit at the piano and tap the keys, even if she didn't know the notes, humming to herself, completely lost in her own world. She loved to draw, too. She'd leave little pictures for me in the kitchen, cats, stars, suns with smiling faces. Rosa paused and looked down her throat, tightening. And then one day, it all stopped. Her eyes welled, and she fought to keep her voice from breaking. The piano disappeared. The crayons went missing. Her toys were thrown out. She stopped singing. She stopped drawing. She stopped laughing. She looked up again now, directly at the judge, her tone firmer, sharper, cutting through the silence like glass. Ellie is not quiet by nature. She was taught to be quiet. She was taught that speaking up was weakness, that emotions were messy and inconvenient, that her voice wasn't wanted. A stunned silence settled over the room. Even the court stenographer slowed her typing. Rosa pressed her palm to her chest, her voice shaking with emotion. "I tried to talk to Vanessa once. I said Ellie was changing, that she looked sad, smaller. Vanessa told me not to interfere, told me that Ellie needed discipline, not softness. After that, I wasn't allowed in Ellie's room anymore." She paused again, the pain raw in her throat. "I should have said something sooner. I should have done more. But I'm saying it now." The room held its breath. No one moved. No one dared. In that fragile, echoing silence, the courtroom heard for the first time not just a defense, but a truth too human to ignore. 1 week had passed since Ellie moved into Adam's home, and in all that time not a single word had escaped her lips. Not a whisper, not a murmur, not even the sound of her humming quietly to herself when she thought no one was listening. The silence was not angry or defiant. It wasn't the silence of a child throwing a tantrum. It was deeper than that, heavier. A silence that had learned how to protect itself, how to build walls so high and thick that even breathing felt like a risk. Ellie drifted through the house like a shadow, always present, never loud, never demanding. She took care of her belongings, kept to herself, and followed simple routines, but she never initiated anything. She didn't resist Adam's presence, but she didn't welcome it either. If he walked into the room, she wouldn't run. She simply became still, as if waiting for him to pass. She sat at the dining table during meals, but never ate more than a few bites, and she would leave quietly when she was done, returning to the corner of the living room or the edge of her bedroom window, always looking, but never quite seeing. Adam tried not to push. He tried not to hover. He didn't ask questions. He didn't make promises. He just stayed. Day after day, he found small ways to show her he was there, not for answers, not for praise, but simply because she mattered. He folded her laundry with quiet care. He made her breakfast and left it on the table, whether she touched it or not. He left the bathroom light on for her at night and placed a new sketchbook and pencils near her bed without a word. Sometimes he caught her glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking, her gaze sharp and uncertain, like someone who had been burned too many times, reaching toward a flame just to see if it still hurt. The silence stretched, but Adam didn't fill it. He knew somehow that words wouldn't fix this. She needed something else, space, without pressure, presence, without demand. And though it broke his heart to hear nothing at all, he began to understand that silence too could speak. It told the story of a child who had learned that speaking up didn't change anything, that words only made you vulnerable, that being quiet and visible made you safer. Adam listened to that silence like a language he had never learned, one built. Not with grammar, but with glances, with tension in shoulders, with the way Ellie flinched just slightly when footsteps came too close. And slowly, quietly, he promised himself that no matter how long it took, days, months, years, he would keep listening. Because maybe, just maybe, the first real word she ever spoke to him again wouldn't come from her mouth, but from the moment she looked him in the eye and knew without question that this time someone was going to stay. That evening the house was quiet, as always. The kind of silence that used to feel suffocating, but had slowly started to feel like a waiting room, heavy with possibility, not emptiness. Adam moved through the kitchen like he did every night, collecting plates that were barely touched, wiping down counters, and trying to respect the quiet without letting it swallow him. He didn't expect anything to change, not that day. The routine had become almost meditative. Cook set the table, let her eat if she wished, clear it all when it was over. But when he returned to the dining table to collect Ellie's glass, something stopped him. There, placed perfectly in the center of her plate, not crumpled or hidden, but positioned with the deliberate care of someone offering a gift, was a piece of white paper. It wasn't folded or signed, just lying there like a message waiting to be read. Slowly, with hands that almost trembled, Adam picked it up. It was a drawing, simple, childlike, and breathtaking. Two stick figures stood side by side, one tall and one small, holding hands. They were in front of a house, his house, unmistakably drawn with its wide windows and the small porch light he always left on for her. The taller figure had a slight curve to the mouth, a soft smile. The smaller one had no mouth at all, just eyes wide, watchful, and full of something Adam could only describe as hope. Above them, a sun shone in the corner, bright yellow and almost too large for the page, and beneath it, scrawled in uneven but careful handwriting, were the words that made Adam's throat tighten and his knees feel weak. I don't know how to say this out loud, so I drew it. He sat down slowly, the paper still in his hands, staring at it like it was sacred. Because to him, it was. This wasn't just a picture. It was a breakthrough. A whisper from the silence that had wrapped Ellie like armor for so long. She hadn't spoken, not with her voice, but she had spoken with everything she had left, with lines, with shapes, with color, and with trust. She had reached out in the only way she could and said, I see you. I feel you. I want to connect. And she had done it without fanfare, without drama, just by sliding a drawing across a table and disappearing into her quiet again. Adam looked toward the hallway where he knew she was watching from just out of sight, and though he didn't see her face, he felt her presence. He didn't call out. He didn't rush to her. He just whispered into the stillness, voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Because he understood that love didn't always come as a hug or a word. Sometimes it came as a pencil line across a page. And in that fragile, hand-drawn connection, Adam found the most honest conversation they had ever had. Adam sat down slowly, almost collapsing into the kitchen chair as though the weight of the moment had finally broken through the careful control he'd been holding onto for days. He placed the drawing gently on the table in front of him, smoothing its edges like it was something delicate, something alive. Then with trembling hands he covered his face, not out of grief, not out of exhaustion, but because something deeper and more sacred was rising inside him, something he hadn't dared to feel in a long time. Hope. Not the loud, reckless kind that crashes into a room and demands attention, but the quiet kind, the fragile kind that returns one breath at a time, carried by crayon lines and childlike stick figures. It came without warning, slipping through his defenses in soft waves, wrapping around his chest like warmth he thought he no longer deserved. In the quiet of the house, in the hush that had defined the space between them for over a week, that single drawing shouted louder than any scream. It was Ellie's voice. Not with words, not with sound, but with intention, with color, with choice. She had made a decision not to explain, not to relive whatever pain she carried, but to share a piece of herself. She had drawn a version of the world where she was not alone. And in that world, Adam was holding her hand. That small gesture, rendered in waxy red and uneven lines, was more than a picture. It was a bridge, a message, a beginning. Adam pressed his palms harder against his eyes, not to hide his tears, but to steady himself as everything inside him began to shift. The guilt, the regret, the nights he lay awake wondering if he had already lost her forever, those things didn't vanish, but they softened. They stepped back. Because now there was something else in the room. Something brighter. Something truer. She had let him in. Just a little. Just enough. And that was everything. He wasn't foolish enough to think the silence would end overnight. He knew there were still walls, still wounds, still long days ahead filled with uncertainty. But for the first time he could see the path forward. Not clearly, not all at once, but it was there. A trail made of pencil lines and brave little letters that said, "I don't know how to say this out loud." So I drew it. Adam lowered his hands and looked at the drawing again, his vision blurred but his heart sharp and steady. This wasn't just Ellie reaching out. It was her testing him, asking without asking, "Will you stay? Will you see me even when I can't speak? Will you keep holding my hand even when I let go of yours?" And his answer, unspoken but certain, was yes. Always yes. Because hope had come home in the form of a crayon sun, and he wasn't going anywhere. Sunday afternoon settled over the park like a warm exhale, the kind that made the air feel slower, gentler, as if the world itself had agreed to take a breath. Children's laughter echoed from nearby jungle gyms, dogs barked in the distance, and birds traced lazy loops across the fading sky. But on the far end of the park, beneath a worn wooden swing set that creaked with every breeze, there was only quiet. Ellie sat on the swing, her legs tucked in slightly, letting herself sway back and forth with no rhythm, no urgency, just movement. It was the kind of motion that didn't need purpose, only presence. Her hands clutched the rusty chains, loosely sleeves of her hoodie pulled down past her wrists, and her eyes were fixed straight ahead, not on the playground, not on the people, but somewhere distant, somewhere private. Adam sat beside her on the adjacent swing, his feet planted firmly on the ground, elbows on his knees, hands laced in front of him. He didn't speak. He didn't try to force a moment or fill the silence. He had learned by now that Ellie didn't need words, at least not yet. What she needed was consistency, patience, a kind of stillness that told her, "I'm here. I see you. I'm not leaving." The wind tousled her hair slightly, and she tucked a strand behind her ear, without thinking, eyes still lost in that faraway place. Occasionally the chains would jingle, or the seat would creak, but otherwise the two of them sat wrapped in the kind of quiet that most people couldn't bear, but that Adam had come to understand was sacred. He had brought her here hoping the fresh air and open space might give her room to breathe, to feel safe outside the corners of his house. But he hadn't expected anything more. That he realized now was the key, letting her lead, letting her decide when to open and when to close. For now, she was swinging. She had come here willingly. That was enough. That was everything. And so he sat beside her, not watching too closely, not waiting too eagerly, just existing in her orbit, steady, silent, and present. The world moved around them, loud and bright and busy, but in their small shared bubble beneath the swing set, time moved differently. It slowed, softened, waited, just like him. The breeze passed gently between them, rustling the grass as the swings creaked with each lazy sway. Adam hadn't said a word. He didn't need to. Over the past few weeks, he had learned that silence was not a void, but a language, and if he listened closely enough, he could hear what Ellie didn't or couldn't say. His presence beside her on that old swing wasn't about entertainment or distraction. It was about patience, about proving minute by minute that he was willing to sit with her in whatever space she chose to exist in. Then, without turning her head, without even looking at him, Ellie spoke. Her voice was soft and hoarse, like something unused for far too long. A question barely more than a whisper, but loud enough to shatter the quiet in his chest. If you hadn't come that day, what would have happened to me? Adam froze. Not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. It wasn't just a question. It was the question. The one that had hung unspoken between them every day since she'd arrived. The one that lived in her silence, in her eyes, in the way she never quite allowed herself to relax. He turned to look at her slowly. She was still staring straight ahead, gripping the swing chains, feet dragging faint lines in the sand beneath her. Her voice hadn't trembled, but everything about her posture said she already knew part of the answer, and she was terrified to hear the rest. Adam's heart clenched. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he knew this wasn't the moment for grand speeches or reassurances she wouldn't believe. He swallowed hard and kept his voice steady, low but honest. "Then I would have failed you," he said, completely. Ellie didn't respond right away. The swing swayed forward and back, then she nodded barely. Not in agreement, but in understanding, like she had tested something and gotten the answer she needed. For the first time, Adam wasn't afraid of her silence, because now he knew she used it with intention. And when she chose to break it just like now, it meant everything. Adam turned toward her slowly, the sound of her voice still settling in the air between them like dust that refused to fall. He hadn't expected her to speak, hadn't dared to hope, really, and yet here she was, breaking the silence, not with anger or accusation, but with a question so raw, so fragile, it felt like it came straight from the center of her being. But before he could find words, before he could shape any kind of response that might match the depth of what she had just asked, Ellie lowered her head, eyes fixed on the tips of her shoes as they dragged small arcs in the sand beneath the swing. And then, even softer than before, almost like a breath carried on wind, she whispered, "I think I would have disappeared." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't said to provoke. There was no tremble in her voice, no plea for pity, only a quiet truth that seemed to echo far beyond her 9 years. And Adam felt something inside him fracture, not the clean break of sudden heartbreak, but the slow, grinding kind that comes from realizing just how close you came to losing something you didn't even fully understand yet. She wasn't saying she would have run away. She wasn't saying she would have died. She was describing a deeper kind of vanishing, the kind where a child slowly fades from the inside out until there's nothing left but a body that keeps moving, eyes that stop seeing, a voice that forgets how to speak. He thought of the way she had first entered his house, small, silent, invisible, not defiant, not afraid, just gone. And now, sitting beside him, her swing barely swaying, she had finally put words to that stillness. It wasn't just a mood, it was survival. Her silence had been a burial, and Adam, without realizing it, had arrived just before the last part of her disappeared. He couldn't speak right away. His throat was tight, his chest full of too many emotions all at once. Guilt, sorrow, love, fear, and most of all, gratitude. Gratitude that he had come, that she was still here, that she had found the strength to say it out loud. Not with volume, but with truth. And though he didn't know how to respond in a way that could carry the full weight of what she had just shared, he did the only thing he could do. He reached over slowly and placed his hand gently on the chain of her swing. Not grabbing, not pulling, just anchoring, just showing her, you're not disappearing anymore. Adam didn't speak. He didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance or comfort, didn't reach for words that might cheapen the gravity of what Ellie had just whispered into the fading light. Instead, he stood up slowly from the swing, his knees stiff but heart racing, and turned toward her. She was still seated, her head bowed, her small hands gripping the chains so tightly her knuckles were white. And though she didn't look up, didn't ask for anything more, something in the slope of her shoulders, some fragile fold in her body, was a silent plea. Don't walk away. So he didn't. Adam crouched in front of her, moving slowly, cautiously, like approaching a bird too wounded to fly but still too alert to trust. He waited a second, maybe two, giving her the choice. And then when she didn't pull away, he wrapped his arms around her, not loosely, not with hesitation, but fully, deeply, like a man anchoring himself to the one thing he could not afford to lose. Ellie didn't return the hug, not at first. Her arms stayed pinned between them, her body stiff. But she didn't resist either. And then after a long, quiet moment, she exhaled. Not a sob, not a cry, just a long, slow breath, as if she had been holding it for weeks, maybe months, maybe even years. That one breath undid him. Adam shut his eyes tightly and buried his face into her shoulder, blinking back tears with all the strength he had. Because this moment, this fragile, fleeting, unspeakably powerful moment, wasn't something he could explain. It wasn't about fixing anything. It wasn't about promises or apologies. It was about staying. That was all. Just staying. Staying through the silence, through the cracks, through the pain no one else had cared enough to see. And as Ellie let herself lean just slightly into his embrace, her forehead resting for a heartbeat against his chest, Adam understood something so clearly it hurt. This child had been abandoned by too many words and too many people who used them to excuse their absence. What she needed now wasn't an explanation. She needed presence, proof, touch without pressure, arms that didn't let go too fast. And so he held her tighter, not to fix, not to force, but to say the one thing she might finally believe: I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Not this time. Not ever. 1 year later, on a crisp spring morning filled with birdsong and light, a small house with a pale blue door opened its arms to the world for the very first time. Nestled at the edge of town, away from traffic and noise, it stood quietly, not flashy or grand, but peaceful, intentional. A single wooden sign hung near the entrance, hand-painted in soft lettering: The Quiet House Project. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no loud speeches, no cameras clamoring for attention. Instead, there were warm cups of tea, mismatched chairs arranged in a circle, and the kind of hush that doesn't feel empty, but sacred. Inside, the walls were lined with books, coloring supplies, blankets folded neatly in corners, and soft music playing low, just enough to calm, not overwhelm. In one room, a piano waited its keys, touched by small fingers not long ago. In another, an art easel stood beside a window, with sunlight spilling across the wooden floor, like an open invitation to create. This wasn't a clinic. It wasn't a school. It was a sanctuary, designed not for fixing children, but for hearing them, even when they had no words. Adam stood near the window, hands in his pockets, watching as the first few children arrived with hesitant steps and guarded eyes. Some clutched stuffed animals. Others held their parents' hands too tightly. A few didn't speak at all. And yet every single one of them found a place here without being forced to perform. Explain or hurry up. The staff, carefully chosen, moved gently through the space teachers, who whispered instead of shouted, therapists who knew when to speak and when to sit still, volunteers trained not in discipline, but in presence. No one asked the children why they were so quiet. No one measured their worth in participation or points. Here, silence was not a problem to be solved. It was a language to be honored. And in the center of it all, Ellie sat at the art table, her hair now longer, her shoulders more relaxed. She wasn't drawing today, just watching, but her eyes held something they hadn't a year ago: peace. She glanced up as a small boy walked in alone, his hoodie too big, his eyes downcast. Without saying a word, she slid a piece of paper toward the seat next to her and nudged a box of crayons in his direction. He didn't look at her, not yet. But he sat down. That was enough. Adam saw the whole thing and felt a quiet pride swell in his chest. Not the kind born from success or praise, but the kind rooted in knowing you've helped create something that will outlive you. Something that matters. The Quiet House Project was no longer a dream. It was real. Built not from blueprints or business plans, but from silence broken slowly into trust. From one child's bravery. From staying. The Quiet House Project was not created for children who were merely shy or reserved. It was built for those who had been taught, whether by trauma or fear or sheer necessity, that silence was the only way to survive. These were the children who once flinched at footsteps, who scanned every room for danger before daring to enter, who learned to make themselves small not out of humility, but out of desperation to stay unseen. Here, behind the soft blue door, and beneath the shelter of sun-warmed windows, those same children were told something revolutionary. You don't have to speak to be heard. You don't have to smile to be safe. You don't have to pretend to be okay to be loved. This house, modest in size but boundless in heart, was created precisely for the ones who had been told to sit still, to hush, to behave, to disappear. For the little girl who once stopped singing because someone mocked the joy in her voice. For the boy who had learned that any word might be used against him, so he spoke none at all. For the siblings who passed notes under their pillows at night because speaking out loud had always ended in punishment. Here no one demanded eye contact. No one forced conversation. The staff didn't pry, they waited. They listened without pressure. They sat beside a child coloring in silence for hours, and that sitting was the therapy. There were no fluorescent lights, no clipboards, no tests, just quiet corners, bean bags, warmth. A space where silence wasn't a symptom, it was a form of communication. One room had a wall of musical instruments, not arranged like a classroom, but scattered like an invitation. A ukulele here, a small drum there, a row of chimes swaying gently near the window. Children were allowed to experiment, to make noise or not. Some banged on keys with wild joy. Others simply ran their fingers across the smooth wood of the instruments without playing a single note. And that too was enough. No one measured progress in words per minute or behavioral charts. Progress looked like a child choosing to sit beside another, like one kid sharing a crayon box with a newcomer, like someone whispering hi after 3 weeks of silent eye contact, or even sometimes progress looked like tears finally falling because they were finally safe enough to be seen. The Quiet House Project was founded on the radical belief that healing is not about speed, it's about trust. And trust, especially for the voiceless, is built one unspoken moment at a time. Ellie had once been that voiceless child, and now she was one of its quiet guides, not through authority, but through presence. She never forced a word from the others. She simply stayed, drew, listened. And that was how they knew this was a house built not just for silence, but for the survival and return of every voice that had been buried by fear. It was just before sunset when Ellie walked outside with a rolled-up sheet of drawing paper tucked carefully under her arm. The air was warm, and the light turned everything gold tree leaves the wooden fence. The quiet steps of children winding down their day inside the quiet house. She moved with quiet purpose, crossing the short path to the front gate where a small bulletin board hung beneath the house's sign. There were already a few notes pinned there. Thank you cards, scribbles from children, a dried flower or two. But Ellie's hands trembled slightly as she unrolled her drawing, flattening it against the board with 4 magnets at each corner. It wasn't a masterpiece in the traditional sense, no perfect perspective or professional polish. But it was alive. In crayon and watercolor, the picture showed a wide courtyard beneath a bright yellow sun. In the center stood a small, upright piano, slightly tilted, as if caught mid-song, its keys glowing under the sky. Around it, children laughed and danced, some holding hands, some twirling alone, one curled up peacefully with a book beneath a tree. Their smiles weren't exaggerated or artificial. They were gentle, true. A kind of happiness that could only be born from safety. In the back corner of the drawing, near a cluster of sunflowers, stood a girl with dark brown hair pulled back in a braid. She wasn't dancing. She wasn't playing. She was simply watching with a calm on her face that held both memory and hope. Above her head, in careful handwriting that slanted slightly to the right, was a single line: "I'm still here, and I'll speak when I'm ready." Adam, who had come out to lock up for the evening, paused a few steps behind her. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The drawing said everything. This wasn't just art. It was Ellie's story in reverse. Her silence had once been a prison. Now it was a choice. And that choice was honored here. The sentence she had written, 7 quiet words, carried more weight than any speech she might have given. It was a declaration of presence, of agency, of trust, of healing. Ellie stepped back, brushing her fingers over the paper one last time, then looked through the gate. A little girl she had met just days ago stood at the window inside, watching her with wide eyes. Ellie smiled, not a big, performative smile, but one that grew from a deep-rooted place. Then she turned and walked back toward the porch, the door swinging open without a creak, as if even the house knew not to disturb the silence. The sun slipped lower, and the wind stirred the edges of the drawing, making it ripple like a flag, not of surrender, but of quiet revolution. From that day forward, visitors would pause at the gate and read the words. Some would cry. Some would smile. Some would simply nod. But all would understand this place was not for noise, but for return. Not for fixing, but for listening. And in that space on that fence, Ellie had left her voice not as a performance, but as a promise. She was still here. And when she was ready, she would speak. Not because someone demanded it, but because finally, there was a place where she could. In the real world, not every wound bleeds on the outside. Some children grow up in homes filled with silence, where fear is disguised as discipline and emotional absence feels like normalcy. Ellie's story reminds us that trauma doesn't always scream. It often whispers, hides in lowered eyes, quiet footsteps, and the brave act of simply surviving another day. If there's one lesson we should carry with us, it's this: presence matters more than perfection. You don't have to have all the right words or answers. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer someone, especially a child, is to stay. To sit beside them without trying to fix them. To be patient even when they say nothing. Healing doesn't come on command. It comes when safety arrives and stays long enough to be trusted. So whether you're a parent, a teacher, a friend, or just someone trying to do better, remember that the quiet ones aren't broken. They're often the strongest people in the room, simply waiting for someone to see them without demanding they perform. Ellie's drawing didn't need applause, it needed a place to exist. And for many kids out there, the world can become that safe place. But only if we choose to build it. One soft voice, one kind moment, one person who doesn't walk away. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share what this story meant to you. If you know someone who needs to hear this, save or share the video with them. And if you believe in the quiet power of stories that heal, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. More true, meaningful stories are coming, and you won't want to miss what's next.